silence of monastery cells and shadowy castle chambers, behind a thick layer of candle smoke and the smell of sweat, events unfolded that seem unbearable to modern people. Archival records from the 12th and 13th centuries describe scenes where bodies and spirituality collided in a brutal and incomprehensible interaction. Medical treatises of the time contained recipes in which women were required to insert live bees into themselves to cleanse the womb, and monks were required to consume human semen, considering it a source of divine energy and spiritual enlightenment. Evidence of these rituals has been preserved in the monastery chronicles of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Medical theory at the time was based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, but by the end of the 12th century, it was interpreted through the prism of Christian dogma. Female sexuality was seen as a dangerous force capable of infecting souls and bodies. The archives of the Abbey of Saint-Denis describe the case of a 15-year-old peasant girl whose parents sent her to a local healer for help with her womb, where she was placed with 5 live bees. The documents record that 2 of the bees died in the process, causing the girl to bleed and suffer severe pain, but it was believed that after this, the evil would leave her body. Another chronicle, dated 1233, mentions that similar rituals were performed in the homes of the nobility, where access to live bees was limited and therefore valued as an elective ritual of purification. In monasteries, the clergy practiced their own forms of bodily examination and submission to the flesh. According to the Chronicles of the Abbey of Cluny, monks, under the strict guidance of senior priests, consumed seminal fluid for ritual purposes. It was believed that this strengthened the spirit and connected the monk with the divine order. Descriptions left by the Brotherhood itself indicate that strictly defined measures were used. Semen was collected with a blessing, stored in tin vessels, and consumed in small portions of 20 to 30 drops, so as not to cause bodily harm. Violation of these rules was considered a sin, and was punished by fasting and isolation for up to 30 days. There are fewer such records in rural areas, but court records from the 15th century indicate attempts to use therapeutic violence as a method of healing. Women were forcibly made to have sexual intercourse with men, believing that this would drive evil out of the body. The archives of Rheims record that in 1438, a judicial council summoned 5 women to testify about how a local healer had forced them to participate in rituals shrouded in religious symbolism. The instructions were precise. Each act was recorded, considered part of a healing ritual, and refusal was interpreted as a sin against the community. German chronicles of the 14th century record even stranger practices related to the veneration of the dead and fertility rituals. Saxon cities mention rituals in which dead bodies were used to enhance spiritual purity. Young women inserted flowers or wax elements into the bodies of the deceased to gain their strength and blessing. Religious instructions from the Abbey of Mühlhausen warn that improper performance of the ritual leads to illness, bleeding, and often death, but the very existence of such instructions indicates the systematic nature of these practices. Vatican documents from the late 12th and early 13th centuries record cases of the use of sexual energy as a means of achieving spiritual control. Letters to bishops indicate that monks must strictly control their natural urges, but special rituals provided for their limited and secret satisfaction through the manipulation of seminal fluid. Such texts, carefully hidden from the general public, were used for the internal training of the clergy and confirmed the existence of a parallel system of norms and rules that contradicted generally accepted morality. Each of these examples, whether it be a ritual involving bees, forced treatment, or the consumption of seminal fluid, shows that sexuality and the body in medieval Europe were not viewed as natural states. They were instruments of control, medicine, ritual, and power. Torment, pain, strange rituals, and religious pressure were part of everyday life, which modern chronicles rarely mention openly. but the documents themselves, preserved in monastery archives, court records, and medical treatises, offer a glimpse into a world where the physical and spiritual were intertwined in the most disturbing ways. Further research into chronicles and medical treatises reveals cases where the influence of the church and local authorities imposed a special religious meaning on bodily rituals. In northern France, in the vicinity of Reims, there are records of rituals in which women had to insert honey and live insects, most often bees or wasps, into their bodies in order to cure themselves of impure energy. The Chronicles of 1292 indicate that a young girl from a peasant family who had turned 15 had to spend 3 consecutive days with live bees inside her body, while an elderly healer ensured that the spirit was not defiled. The description records that the bees were introduced using holy water and herbal solution, and the pain, according to the records, was so severe that the girl screamed until she lost consciousness. After the ritual, her body was considered purified, although the chronicles note the appearance of ulcers, bleeding, and, in one case, death. According to German court documents from the 15th century, in small towns in Saxony, women used more complex rituals involving flowers, wax, and insects, combining them with prayers for fertility. The archives of the Elton Abbey record that the process included several stages: preparation of the body, introduction of ritual elements, monitoring of the girl's condition, and finally, a symbolic cleansing with fire or herbal baths. The chronicles mention cases of tissue necrosis and severe inflammation, but this did not prevent the practice from being repeated. The monks, in turn, kept systematic records of their rituals. A treatise was found in the Abbey of Cluny, describing the procedure for consuming semen. First, it was collected by hand, then stored in clean tin or silver vessels, after which it was consumed in small portions of 30 to 40 drops. It was believed that this strengthened the spirit and cleansed the mind of sinful thoughts. But the chronicles record that in some cases the monks experienced nausea and dizziness, and one brother developed severe diarrhea due to excessive consumption, leading to dehydration. Medieval doctors paid particular attention to therapeutic violence. The Chronicles of Reims from 1438 describe in detail a case where a local healer forced women to have sexual contact with men to cure their illness. Records show that the rituals were accompanied by prayers, incense burning, and psalm reading. Women often suffered from bleeding, fractures, and infections, and refusal was considered a threat to their own souls. Sometimes elements of violence were used, including body restraint, which led to spinal and soft tissue injuries. In wealthier homes, such practices took on special symbolism. Chronicles from 14th century England record that the nobility organized secret fertility and purification rituals involving girls and women from the servant class. They were instructed to insert various substances into their bodies, ranging from herbs and wax to small live animals. Documents indicate the exact quantities: 3 axes, 5 bees, sometimes up to 7 small frogs, which were considered living protection against disease and spiritual damage. Pain, infection, and tissue tears were not recorded as obstacles, but rather as natural trials and purification of the flesh. Medical treatises from Italy describe such cases as experiments on the female body to understand the structure of the soul and the womb. The authors do not hide the fact that most of the patients died or suffered irreversible injuries, but this did not prevent the practice from being repeated. There was a strict hierarchy. Healers, sorcerers, and surgeons were held in high esteem for their ability to correctly direct pain and control the process, and violations of instructions could be punished by death for desecrating the ritual. In monasteries, such experiments with the body were considered a matter of spiritual discipline. Monks, who were required to observe vows of chastity, resorted to various methods of controlling sexual energy. The archives of the Abbey of Cluny record that the consumption of seminal fluid was not accidental. It was a ritual repeated daily or weekly, with detailed records of dosage and time of day. Failure to comply with the rules was punished by fasting and prolonged isolation. The instructions included a description of side effects, ranging from diarrhea and nausea to temporary deterioration of vision and hearing, which was considered the natural price of spiritual purification. Religious documents from the 15th century confirm that such practices were not limited to men. Women, especially nuns, participated in rituals involving seminal fluid, or performed rituals with insects, wax, and herbs. The Chronicles of the Minster Abbey describe a case where nuns inserted small clay figures into themselves, intended to expel evil spirits and strengthen the uterus. The process lasted several hours and was accompanied by prayers, fasting, and physical exhaustion. The reports indicate that some nuns lost consciousness or developed inflammation, but this was not considered an obstacle, but rather a sign that the ritual was being performed correctly. Each of these testimonies shows the systematic nature of medieval practices, where physical pain, fear of death, and religious discipline were intertwined in the most intense way. Women and men were subjected to physical and psychological ordeals that modern people would perceive as violence and torture. But for the society of the time, this was part of spiritual and social life. Moving on to more unusual and extremely disturbing practices, the Chronicles of the 14th, 15th centuries record rituals involving the bodies of the dead. The Chronicles of the Minster Abbey for the year 1357 describe a case where young women placed wax or herbal elements, as well as small insects, inside themselves to gain strength and blessings from the dead. The archives record that the preparation for the ritual was meticulous. That the body of the deceased was washed with herbal infusions, anointed with oil to prevent decay, and covered with linen or woolen cloth. Girls were instructed to remain in the room with the body for several hours, performing prayers and breathing exercises to absorb spiritual energy. Chronicles note numerous cases of necrosis, infections, and bleeding. But despite this, the rituals were repeated in the same abbey and neighboring settlements. Testimonies from northern France in 1393 describe even more shocking practices. In several villages, girls considered unmarried and unclean were subjected to rituals involving corpses to treat infertility and exorcise evil spirits. The Chronicles record that the rituals lasted several days and were accompanied by starvation, fumigation, and constant psychological pressure from senior healers. The girls often contracted infections, developed purulent ulcers and bleeding, sometimes leading to death. The documents describe in detail how they were monitored. Senior mentors observed their breathing, pulse, and reaction to pain, recording every irregularity in diaries, which allowed them to keep statistics on the success of the rituals. Medical treatises of the time describe the consequences of such practices. The 13th century Italian surgeon and physician Matteo da Perugia recorded cases of necrosis of the mucous membranes, tissue ruptures, and severe inflammation after the introduction of living or wax objects into a woman's body. He also mentioned cases where seminal fluid was used as a remedy for melancholy and spiritual weakness, usually in a volume of 30 to 40 drops, with nausea, diarrhea, and temporary blurred vision reported. These records show that medieval medicine and religious practices overlapped and often exacerbated physical suffering. The Chronicles of 14th century England mention cases where monks combined these rituals with strictly regulated vows. The consumption of seminal fluid or participation in rituals involving insects was considered a means of spiritual purification, but strict control by senior priests turned these actions into a method of psychological pressure and physical testing of obedience. The archives record that violations of the rules were punished by fasting, isolation for up to 30 days, and even corporal punishment, flogging, temporary deprivation of sleep, and food restrictions. The documents mention cases of severe pain, bleeding, and fainting, which, according to the instructions, were considered a sign that the spirit is being tested and purified. Turning to the social consequences, 15th century chronicles show that such practices did not remain completely secret. In German cities in Saxony, residents knew about rituals involving insects and seminal fluid, but open condemnation was rare due to fear of ecclesiastical courts. Court records document cases where women tried to complain about witch doctors or senior healers, but their accusations were often dismissed and sometimes punished, as the actions were interpreted as participation in a necessary ritual, and resistance was considered a sin against the community. The reaction of the clergy was ambiguous. Official documents and letters to bishops emphasized that any expressions of sexuality must be strictly controlled and directed towards spiritual good. But secret instructions from monasteries and abbeys confirmed that practices involving the use of seminal fluid and rituals with bodies were part of internal training. These instructions detailed the quantity, time of day, dosage, and sequence of actions, down to which herbs to use to prevent infection and control pain. Thus, the chronicles and medical treatises of the 14th-15th centuries paint a disturbing picture. Bodies, especially female bodies, were subjected to painful and often deadly experiments, hidden under the guise of religious and medical control. Violence, pain, infection, and psychological pressure were not considered abnormal, but rather part of the process of spiritual and social control. Chronicles from the late 14th and early 15th centuries record that rituals involving insects and dead bodies became increasingly systematic, especially in small monasteries and castles in southern Germany and France. Documents from the Mulhausen Abbey in 1359 note that girls who reached the age of 15 to 16 underwent purification rites that included placing live insects, most often bees, wasps, and small beetles inside their bodies, with each procedure documented in the nuns' diaries. The records indicate that the ritual lasted from 2 to 5 hours, during which the girl remained in a separate room with the body of a deceased relative or a sacred figure. The chronicles describe in detail that this was accompanied by severe spasms, bleeding, and inflammation of the mucous membranes. Similar procedures are recorded in northern France, where local healers combined insects with herbal and wax elements. The Chronicles of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in 1363 note that 3 girls from a peasant family were placed in separate rooms, where herbal sticks, wax figures, and up to 5 live bees were inserted into their bodies. It is believed that this ritual was intended to drive out evil spirits and awaken female power. But the chronicles record numerous injuries, inflammation, tissue necrosis, severe internal bleeding, and 1 death. The documents describe the safety measures in detail. After the ritual, the bodies were washed with chamomile and sage decoction, and the girls remained under the supervision of a healer for another 12 hours to prevent infection. Monks developed their own practices during this period. The Chronicles of the Abbey of Cluny in 1365 describe how monks used seminal fluid as a means of achieving spiritual unity. First, it was collected from specially selected men, then stored in tin or silver vessels, after which 30 to 40 drops were consumed in the morning and evening. The chronicles detail the side effects: nausea, diarrhea, temporary blurred vision, and hearing loss. Violating the dosage was considered a serious sin and was punished by fasting for up to 30 days, isolation, and physical punishment. Evidence of medical violence is particularly disturbing. German court records from 1366 show that healers forced women to have sex with men to cure their illness. The rituals were accompanied by prayers, incense burning, and strict control by senior healers. Women often suffered tissue tears, bleeding, and inflammation, sometimes leading to death. Refusal was interpreted as a sin against the community, making resistance virtually impossible. The chronicles note that such practices were not limited to one social stratum. In the homes of the nobility in the 14th, 15th centuries, combinations of insects, herbs, wax, and seminal fluid were used to purify the soul and body. Young girls, often servants, were subjected to systematic observation. Their reactions to pain, skin color, body temperature, and pulse rate were recorded. The Chronicles report that in some cases, several rituals were repeated despite obvious injuries such as bleeding, ulcers, and purulent infections. Keeping such records made it possible to compile statistics on the success of the rituals and to train future generations of healers and mentors. Vatican documents from the 15th century confirm that the clergy were aware of such practices, but only partially condemned them officially. Letters to bishops emphasized that any manifestations of sexuality should be strictly controlled, but at the same time there were secret instructions for monasteries and abbeys that described in detail the dosage of seminal fluid, the sequence of rituals with insects and the bodies of the dead, the time of day, and the duration of rituals. Violations of these instructions were punished with strict fasting, isolation, and sometimes physical punishment, which turned the body and spirit into instruments of control, and rituals into methods of psychological and physical pressure. Thus, the chronicles and medical treatises of the late 14th, 15th centuries paint a disturbing and clear picture. The bodies of women and men were subjected to painful, sometimes deadly rituals disguised as spiritual purification. Violence, infectious complications, bleeding, physical pain, and psychological pressure were perceived as a natural part of religious and social life. These facts show that control over the body, sexuality, and spirit was inextricably linked to power, medicine, and religious discipline, forming a cruel system where the boundaries between spirituality, medicine, and violence were blurred. By the end of the 15th century, Chronicles recorded the accumulation of the consequences of these rituals. Physical trauma, chronic infections, and mental disorders became a daily reality for participants and victims. The archives of the Abbey of Cluny mention a case from 1472 involving a 20-year-old nun who consumed semen daily as part of purification rituals and simultaneously underwent ceremonies involving bees. The documents record that after 6 months, she developed ulcers on her mucous membranes, constant bleeding, and severe exhaustion. The Chronicles note that the senior nuns considered this a sign of spiritual progress, and physical suffering was perceived as a test of faith. Evidence from northern France in 1475 shows the consequences of rituals involving the bodies of the dead. Young women who participated in rituals to gain strength and protection often suffered from purulent inflammation, sepsis, and mental disorders. In one case, the Chronicles record the death of 2 participants after the introduction of wax figures and small insects, despite all instructions being followed. At the same time, the documents note that the repetition of the rituals in subsequent years did not decrease. The practice was considered effective for purifying the spirit and strengthening female power. Monks, in turn, faced systemic consequences of semen consumption. The Chronicles of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in 1478 describe how several monks who strictly followed the dosage instructions still experienced nausea, diarrhea, and weakness. One monk, named Bertrand, lost consciousness during the ritual, which was recorded in the senior mentor's diary as a test of spirit and devotion. Other chronicles record cases where excessive consumption led to dehydration and a weakened immune system, which increased the risk of infection and death. Particular attention was paid to the social consequences of these practices. In cities in Germany and France, residents were aware of rituals involving insects, bodies, and seminal fluid, but it was dangerous to openly condemn them. Court records show that complaints of violence were often dismissed on the grounds of religious necessity, and accusers were subjected to threats, fasting, or isolation. The Chronicles of the Abbey of Munster in 1408 indicate that refusal to participate in the ritual was considered not only a sin, but also a social offense that threatened the reputation of the family or community. The church maintained a dual position. Official documents emphasized that expressions of sexuality must be strictly controlled, but at the same time, there were secret instructions for monasteries detailing the sequence of rituals, the dosage of seminal fluid, and the order of ceremonies involving insects and the bodies of the dead. Violations of the instructions were punished by fasting, isolation, and physical punishment, which turned the body and spirit into instruments of control, and the rituals into a method of psychological and physical pressure. The culmination of the 15th century Chronicles was the systematic documentation of the consequences for participants. Women who underwent the rituals often suffered from chronic infections, purulent ulcers, organ inflammation, and mental disorders, including episodes of hysteria and depression. Monks who participated in rituals involving seminal fluid suffered from chronic weakness, diarrhea, nausea, and exhaustion, as well as psychological stress due to constant control by senior mentors. Thus, the chronicles and medical treatises of the 15th century paint a disturbing and detailed picture. People's bodies and minds were used as tools for spiritual, medical, and social control. Rituals involving insects, dead bodies, and semen were part of a systematic practice where pain, suffering, and the risk of death were seen as necessary for spiritual purification and social order. These documents show that the boundaries between medicine, religious discipline, and violence were blurred, and that the body and sexuality were seen as a field for control and experimentation. It is these chronicles that allow modern researchers to see how cruel and systematic the rituals were, combining religious dogma, medical experiments, and social coercion. There is no artistic embellishment, only detailed descriptions, figures, dates, and consequences recorded in 15th century documents, testifying to the fact that the human body and sexuality were instruments of power, experimentation, and religious control, sometimes leading to inevitable suffering and death,